Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we're set to deliberate the latest developments here in Israel, throughout the region, and beyond, with chief focus today on the situation vis-a-vis Iran's nuclear program, the decision by the ICC to issue arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, alongside the belligerence of the Iranian proxies throughout the region, including in Yemen as well as in Lebanon. All that and more we will discuss just in a couple of minutes. But before that, it's always important to remember that 413 days ago, the Islamist Hamas and its terror affiliates in the Gaza Strip had launched a surprise onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping some 250 people, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. 101 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. Let's now turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Mr. Marshall Billingsley, formerly an Assistant Secretary General of NATO and U.S. Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for countering terror financing, and a long list of other positions. It's great to see you, Marshall. I'd like to start with the current decision by the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency to pass a resolution. 19 out of the 33 members have voted in favor to call upon Secretary General Grossi, among others, to establish a comprehensive report by the spring of 2025 in order to evaluate whether the Iranians are in breach of their non-proliferation treaty. What can you tell us about that, and what are the implications that are derived if it is indeed the situation?
Well, it's great to be with you and also to be on this show with my good friend, former Secretary Mark Kemet and Doron. What I would say is that we have been living through a 4-year postmodern version of Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot. The Biden administration has sat around for 4 years waiting for the Iranians to show up to negotiate a return to the JCPOA. They squandered those 4 years. The Iranians bilked the Biden administration for more than $130 billion in non-enforcement of sanctions, and that money flowed to both the terror apparatus and their nuclear weapons program. The United States, the Biden administration, also prevented the IAEA Board of Governors from moving forward with this type of resolution that has now finally broken loose. And that's a welcome development, but it's too little too late. The most important thing to keep in mind, Jonathan, is, and for your viewers, is the UN Security Council snapback sanctions. That authority expires in 2025. And what's crucial is that we find ourselves in the next Trump administration in a position where the permanent members of the Security Council, at least one of them, is able to trigger that process, which is an unstoppable process. The United States will be in a position to veto any resolution that tries to derail the reimposition of sanctions 30 days after a member of the JCPOA asks for that. So this is all setting the stage for a diplomatic push at the Security Council to reimpose those sweeping UN sanctions.
There are also, of course, the United Kingdom, France, and Britain that have that same not position on the UN Security Council. France and Britain do, but Germany doesn't. Nonetheless, Germany does have the opportunity to snap back sanctions, to call for it, and at a time when relations between Berlin and Tehran are at an all-time low, particularly demanding for the clear understanding from the IAEA whether or not the Iranians are in breach of their NPT obligations, puts them, of course, in a position to do so. Now, let's turn elsewhere in Washington, D.C., where we're joined by retired Brigadier General Mark Kemet, formerly an Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, alongside a long list of other positions. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you to weigh in on this situation where the Iranians are basically saying if the Europeans, the E3, do decide to enforce a snapback of sanctions against them over breaches of their nuclear commitments, they will opt out of the non-proliferation treaty altogether. What are we to make out of that?
Well, it may be that this back and forth is fairly meaningless at this point. To quote a former author in the United States, sound and fury signifying nothing, for two reasons. Number one, by the time this decision is made, President Trump will have been in power for about 2 to 3 months, and I would expect the situation on the ground potentially to be significantly different than we're seeing now. Second, I think we're going to see major obstruction by the Chinese. What's keeping Iran afloat is the fact that they've been able to increase their oil production by about 500 million barrels. And all of that is being purchased by China. China is addicted to Iranian oil. Snapback sanctions would probably have a significant impact on oil production and oil sales. And I just don't see that anything happening at the UN, particularly since they don't have an enforcement mechanism other than sanctions, which are porous as Swiss cheese, will have any difference at all. So the combination of President Trump coming in, the Chinese factor, and sanctions don't work, I think this is a great effort, but I don't think it's going to end up anywhere.
Indeed. Well, let's turn now to central Israel, where we're joined by Brigadier General in Reserve Doron Gavish, the commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to immediately ask you on the calculus with regard to Iran's nuclear proliferation. It may, according to a number of top experts in this line of field, trigger an Iranian decision to ratchet up its uranium enrichment to levels of 90% purity, something that, of course, would put them into a course of collision with the state of Israel. Israel has already said, including Israeli Defense Minister, outgoing Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as his successor Israel Katz, alongside, of course, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, they all have aligned their positions. The top priority of the state of Israel is to guarantee that Iran does not achieve nuclear weapon capabilities. And if it does cross that threshold to purely 90%, there is no civic application to that. That would be a declaration of intent that it already does to a lesser degree at 60%. Nevertheless, this is something that may trigger an Israeli response. Do you see this actually evolving into that, or will the Iranians try to play their cards a little bit more prudently?
Well, Jonathan, first of all, I think that it is not only an Israeli issue. This is an international issue. We all know who is Iran. I think in the last year, we even know better who is Iran. When it comes to Israel, we always differ between capabilities and intentions. And from the military point of view, you have to prepare yourself to capabilities. And if there are some capabilities that you must deny from your enemy, you have to prepare yourself for that. When it comes to the intentions, then you could speculate what are the intentions. But with the Iranians, if in the past we were speculating, in the last year again, we saw that they are shooting missiles toward Israel. I'm not sure that if we would sit together, even these people around this table a year ago, we would say, yes, for sure, the Iranians would shoot 300 projectiles toward Israel in April and another 200 projectiles in October. So this is even much more worried when we're talking, of course, about weapons of mass destruction. So we see that the Iranians are there, the intentions are there, and we cannot allow ourselves that they would have this capability. So Israel, from its own interest for sure, would have to do everything to prepare itself to the moment that if it would be necessary to deal with this issue. I think that sanctions are super important, but we all, this is the coalition and Israel, we have to prepare ourselves also to other options, and all should be on the table.
All right, let's zoom out a little bit from Iran. The Iranians are activating, directing, advising, and providing the munitions to its proxies for the purpose of conducting various hostile activities from the Red Sea all the way to the northern Levant. Let's start with the Ansar Allah terror group, namely the Houthi-dominated terror Iranian proxy in Yemen, launching 3 separate ballistic missiles towards Israeli territory just this week. Other munitions against cargo vessels, including a Turkish cargo vessel that has brought up now the wrath of Ankara. Mr. Billingsley, what are we to make out of the current state of play with regard to efforts led by the United States under Central Command to confront this challenge that is disrupting maritime shipping in the strategic Strait of Bab el-Mandeb and adjacent waterways?
I believe that very, very quickly in the next administration, the rules of engagement that are currently crippling CENTCOM's ability to truly deal with the Houthi threat will likely be adjusted. Much as President Trump relaxed the rules of engagement for Central Command to wipe out ISIS in the early days of his presidency. So I think the Houthis are trading on borrowed time at this stage, certainly their senior leadership, and I would expect to see action sort of imminently within an early stage. One other point to make, it's not just the Iranians funneling weapons to their terror proxies. The IDF, of course, has determined that Hezbollah in particular is in possession of large quantities of Russian supplied weapons. And of course, the Biden administration completely upended our policy in the United States dating from the Reagan administration of not paying ransom or trading for hostages. And the Bidenists released for a D-list basketball player, Victor Bout, the Merchant of Death, who is now known to be collaborating and cooperating with the Houthis, brokering sales of weapons. So the Russians are part of this problem as well.
Indeed. Well, the president of Belarus came out and actually stated that blatantly, noting that Russia is not only providing them munitions, but also advising them on a number of levels that was also circulating within the various intelligence communities in the West for quite some time now. General Kimmett, what are we to make out of Russia's decision to enter that specific theater? Is this yet again another step in the escalation dominance that we see on a global level?
Well, I think it reminds us that this holiday from history that we've had for so many years is coming back to bite us in the nose. Look, the United States and Russia, whether it was Russia or the Soviet Union, have been engaging in proxy warfare between each other since the foundation of the post-World War II Soviet Union. We played back and forth with the Soviets in Africa in terms of proxy warfare down there. We saw that in Afghanistan. In many ways, we saw that in the Warsaw Pact. So we shouldn't be surprised that, particularly with what we're doing in Ukraine, directly supporting and overtly supporting the Ukrainians, that the Russians aren't reciprocally trying to get their pound of flesh to interfere with our operations, trying to affect stability in the Middle East. So Marshall's exactly right. We've seen Russian equipment in Hezbollah. We clearly are seeing that equipment starting to feed into Yemen as well. I don't think that this is, as we've said many, many times before, this does not indicate any kind of ideological bonding between Russia and Iran by supporting its proxies. This is just what we've seen in our lifetime, which is this oftentimes overt but usually covert proxy warfare between the United States and once Soviet, now Russia itself.
Before we move to the Lebanese theater, I'd like to ask you, General Gavish, last night rocket alert sirens sounded in the Judean desert as well as in the area of the Dead Sea. The publication by the IDF was that a missile or a projectile was launched out of Yemen towards Israeli territory. From what I'm not mistaken, and I'd like to hear your take on this, Israeli aircraft have launched it out of this intercepted it outside of Israeli airspace. Was it the case? And if so, why rocket alert sirens sounding at a time when we do have still civilians in the vicinity?
Well, first of all, it was the ballistic missiles that came from Yemen toward Israel. It was intercepted by Arrow 3. And this is the reason why there were sirens in this area. But we see, Jonathan, going back to your comment about Lebanon, we see in the last few days, week, a little bit more that the Lebanese or that the Hezbollah is trying to shoot missiles or rockets in their case toward, I would say, much longer that they did before. They were launching rockets toward the central of Israel, Haifa area, and Sharon area, which are the Sharon area and of course Tel Aviv. This is in the central of Tel Aviv. Haifa is in the north, but not very north. So they are trying to target basically civilians. This is also, a change because before they were saying that they were shooting rockets at military installations. They can't say it anymore because it is going through toward cities, and of course in Kiryat Shmone and Nahariya. Those are towns in the northern part of Israel. Unfortunately, yesterday we had a young guy that was killed from such a rocket. He was driving his truck. He heard the siren. He went aside and stood by the wall, but very unfortunately, the rocket fell right next to him, and he was immediately killed. So although there is a quite impressive rate of interceptions, still we continuously say that the defense is not hermetic, and unfortunately we see something like this. So the Hezbollah is still trying to shoot rockets toward Israel. You've talked about Yemen, or we just mentioned Yemen, but we have to also remember that this week we had UAVs that were shot toward Israel from Iraq. Even one of them came from Syria. And the other thing that I would like to mention is that what we also continuously see is the coordination and the cooperation between CENTCOM and the Israeli forces. Some of those projectiles that we talked about were intercepted by CENTCOM forces, and this is something which is continuously happening. We always say that for some people it looks trivial now that this is something that is happening, but this is not trivial at all. And this is due to the leadership of General Kurila, head of CENTCOM. His leadership is tremendous in the support of Israel, and we feel it and we appreciate it very much here in Israel.
Absolutely. Well, I know for sure that every Israeli is deeply grateful to the United States of America and to Central Command in particular for all the hard-fought hours against various projectiles being launched towards Israeli territory and going really beyond the call of duty in order to fulfill their pledge to the Constitution and ultimately to the pledge of being a good ally during times of need. But Mr. Billingsley, I'd like to ask you particularly about Lebanon. We saw Amos Hochstein, the White House special envoy of President Biden, coming to Beirut, then moving to Jerusalem, then Tel Aviv for various discussions. It seems like the gap is narrowing, but we're not there yet. Is this a situation in which we can expect a certain paradigm shift in the current state of play, or is this going to get dragged along to a point where strategic interests would be ultimately receiving a certain priority since Hezbollah is not yet eradicated?
they're not eradicated, and they have a high potential to rebound if the pressure comes off. I agree with General Gavish that sanctions can be quite effective when they're vigorously enforced. We cut Iranian exports to China down to about 200,000 barrels a day maximum. They're now back up selling close to 2 million barrels a day. So a tenfold increase under Biden. And that revenue is what's fueling the rearmament of the terror proxies. I'm glad Amos is getting his frequent flyer miles in the last 45 days of this administration, but I really fail to understand why the state of Israel would feel compelled at this stage to negotiate a ceasefire, particularly given that they may want to engage the next Trump administration to determine, what might be a more advantageous cessation of hostilities. My final point on this is back to CENTCOM. Do recall, please, I hope your viewers recall that it was President Trump who changed longstanding policy of assigning Israel to European command. The reason we've been able to so effectively collaborate and work with General Gavish and other elements of the IDF is because of that switch of Israel into the CENTCOM structure, which has made the coordination, I think, very, very highly effective.
Absolutely. Well, General Kemet, naturally, the Lebanese themselves, at least the non-Shiite sects in Lebanon, would very much want to see Hezbollah diminish its power to a point where they could push back on Iranian influence in Lebanon. That's not currently the case, is it?
I don't think they either have the capability or, candidly, do they have the willingness to try to change the status quo inside of Lebanon. The fact remains, Hezbollah is part of the political process. They are very popular inside of Lebanon because they're seen as part of the resistance against Israel. And this is a country that doesn't even have a president, much less a functioning LAF. We poured a lot of money into the Lebanese armed forces, but candidly, I don't even think that they'd be able to uphold any of the provisions of the UN Security Council resolution if they were put into southern Lebanon. By the way, just an aside on CENTCOM CENTCOM getting Israel from EUCOM, the joke at CENTCOM was the two most important things that happened during the Trump administration was that Israel became part of CENTCOM, and the Americans pushed hard and succeeded to get the embassy in Jerusalem. Both of them very clear signs of continued American support. The last thing I would say is simply, I agree with all the comments. There's very little chance that either Israel or Hezbollah would agree to a ceasefire and peace deal right now, simply because they know that in 60 days there's going to be, quote, a new sheriff in town, and if he doesn't like that deal, or the Israelis don't like that deal, that deal's off the table.
Indeed. Well, we have less than 2 minutes left, and therefore I'd like to give each of you a chance to provide somewhat of insight for the upcoming weekend. Are we to expect something dramatic, or if not, a bit longer than that into the horizon? General Kemet, we'll start with you.
I don't see anything on the horizon. In fact, I think it's status quo. I don't believe Hamas will ever agree to a provision in a peace deal that will allow, or Hezbollah, that would allow a re-entry of Israeli forces if there are violations of any agreement. So that's a non-starter. So again, I don't see anything in the near-term horizon that is going to substantively change the situation in the region.
General Gavish?
Well, Jonathan, we have to remind ourselves that we didn't achieve yet our goals for this war, starting in the Gaza Strip, mainly with the hostages. We have still 101 hostages which are held by the Hamas terrorist organizations. We didn't finish yet also in the northern part of Israel. There are more than 60,000 Israelis which are refugees in their home. And so we still have a way to go. And I think that we deserve, and those people are deserved to be back to their homes safely, And this is for whatever would be the agreement in the northern part of Israel. And whenever it would decided to be effective, they deserve to go back to their home and to live safely over there.
Absolutely. Mr. Billingsley?
Jonathan, I think I'll finish where you started, which is with the International Criminal Court. The decision to issue arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant is reprehensible. Mark and I, together in the Bush administration, worked as we unsigned that treaty for precisely the same reasons that Israel has never joined that treaty or recognized it as valid, because the treaty allows rogue prosecutors without any supervision to do exactly what is now being done to Israeli officials. The fact that this particular rogue prosecutor is also under investigation for sexual misconduct is significant. The Biden administration revoked the executive order that we put in place under President Trump to provide sanctions against the prosecutor and others if they targeted Americans. I expect very, very quickly in the next administration to see a resumption of that executive order, and I expect Congress to actually legislate on this very matter.
Indeed. Well, as the future National Security Advisor and currently Congressman Mike Waltz said, come January 20th, and the ICC will have to deal with a whole lot of new challenges. But this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to immediately thank General Kimmett, Mr. Billingsley, and General Gavish. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel, and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.
Jerusalem Studio, now available on Spotify.
Israel has launched operations
on Vladimir Putin.
helping Iran develop. We have logic, we have rationale, we understand how the system operates.